right, the first topic in Lesson 9 and your only topic in Lesson 9 for Algebra 1 is multiplying and dividing integers. Now, we've already talked about adding and subtracting integers, and let's review that. We already know that a negative plus a negative is always negative. So, for example, a negative 5 plus a negative 3 is a negative 8. And that makes sense. If you're at 0 degrees temperature and it drops 5 degrees and then drops 3 more, it's dropped a negative 8. Or in other words, it's 8 degrees below 0. So a negative plus a negative is always negative. How about if you're adding a negative and a positive, or vice versa? So in other words, you're adding numbers and one's positive and one's negative. Well, you take the difference between the two numbers and it carries the sign of the larger. So for example, if I have a negative 5 plus 2, take the difference of 5 and 2, which is 3. 5 is larger than 2. 5 is carrying the negative sign, so it's a negative 3. And if we reason that out, if we're at 0 degrees, the temperature drops 5, so we're now at a negative 5, and then goes up 2 degrees because of a positive 2. We're now at a negative 3 degrees below 0, or a negative 3. The third one that we talked about in Lesson 8 was, Lesson 6 and 7, was subtracting integers. Now when you subtract integers, the first number stays the same. You change your subtraction symbol to addition, but in doing so you have to take the opposite of the next number. So really what we do is we change the subtraction to an addition problem. So a negative 4 minus a negative 2 is exactly the same thing as a negative 4 plus 2. Now we use our rule for addition when you're adding a negative and a positive. So take the difference between 4 and 2, which is 2, and it carries the sign of the bigger one. 4 is larger than 2, 4 is negative, so it's a negative 2. All right, now for the multiplying and dividing integers. Place this in your notes, and make sure you have labeled your notes as multiplying and dividing integers, Lesson 9. So right underneath that topic title, let's write down the two rules. Now these are the same, regardless if you're multiplying or dividing. A negative times a negative is always positive. And we'll go through an example of that in a little bit. A negative divided by a negative is always positive. So this is unlike addition, isn't it? Remember with addition we said a negative plus a negative is always negative. Little different type of rule. So a negative times a negative is positive, and also a negative divided by a negative is always positive. So example 1, copy this down in your notes. Let's see, I know that a negative times a negative is always positive, and then I just multiply the numbers. So 4 times 2 is 8, it's a positive 8. And likewise, if I'm dividing a negative by a negative, it's positive. And I don't need the positive, but just to emphasize that, I'll write it. And what's 10 divided by 5? 2. So really, I could just leave it then as like that. So I have a positive 8 and a positive 2. So a negative times a negative, or a negative divided by a negative, always a positive answer. All right, now, one more type of rule. How about if you're multiplying or dividing and you have one of each? So say I'm multiplying a negative times a positive, or vice versa, a positive times a negative. Or suppose I'm dividing a negative and a positive, or vice versa, a positive and a negative. It's always negative. Your answer is always negative. Now, notice that this is, again, unlike addition. Remember when we took, you added a negative and a positive? You take the difference between the two and it carries the sign of the bigger. Here I get a negative 2, but how about here? 4 plus a negative 2, take the difference, carries the sign of the bigger. 4 is bigger, it's positive. So it carries the sign of the bigger. Now, when you're multiplying and dividing, it's always negative. So these are actually easier rules. Let's take a look at an example. Example 2, write this down. All right, so in both these, I'm multiplying or dividing a positive and a negative. our answers are always negative. And then multiply or divide. 5 times 3, 15. 20 divided by 2, 10. So when you're multiplying or dividing a negative and a positive, always negative. Now to summarize these two rules, let's take a look at example 3. And I want you to write these down and then try them. And then pause it while you work them out, and you can play it here in a little bit to see if you got them right. All right, in example 3 on the left column, so in other words, these over here, you're multiplying or dividing two negatives. So when you multiply two negatives or divide two negatives, it's always a positive answer. And I'll just write the plus for positive here. You don't have to. Now, so the first one would be 5. 4 divided by 2 is 2. 3 times 6 is 18. 30 divided by 6 is 5. All positive answers because I'm multiplying or dividing two negatives. On the right column, since I'm multiplying or dividing here, and I'm multiplying or dividing a negative and a positive, what's a negative times a positive or a negative divided by a positive? It's always going to be negative. So right away, you can determine your sign is negative. On the first one, I'd have 2. Let's see, 10 divided by 10 is 1. 4 times 2 is 8. And 40 divided by 20 is 2. And again, they're all negatives. So the topic in this lesson was multiplying and dividing integers. So just review it and make sure you have the notes for this.